Hey watercolor wizards, Hajra here. Today we're going to be working on a Henry Justice Ford master's study of a piece from 1898 from the Arabian Nights, and it's Sindbad, or the proper pronunciation, which is Sindbad, being carried off by the giant bird called the Roc, and that's R-O-C. Thanks for parking your brushes here, and let the epic painting adventures begin.
So what is it you liked so much about Henry Justice Ford? What made you want to do a master's study?
Well, Henry Justice Ford is really somebody who inspired a lot of the later Golden Age artists, because he was operating a little bit before some of the other artists that we like, or that I have covered before, like GOUACHE and Nielsen and Leyendecker and Muha and everybody. So he was a little bit before all these guys by a few decades, although he was operating into the early time of when they were starting and everything as well. His illustrations became iconic for all of these fairy books that are Andrew Lang's fairy books. And the first one was the Blue Fairy book that was released in 1889. And he was only 29 at the time when he contributed to that first one. As the series became increasingly popular, more volumes were released, and he became the sort of sole illustrator for that. And there was green fairy books and lilac fairy books and all sorts of fairy books of different colors, and they had all these fairy tales and myths and legends from across the world, so they were actually a really great collection. He ended up doing more than 1,000 images total for these fairy books, and each fairy book had about 100 illustrations. But they were really influential as a result of him having done so many, you know? And one of the things that draws me to him, he sort of had a very non-Orientalist respect for all cultures. So he was drawing these people from all these different cultures, and some of these fairy tales were European, some of them were Middle Eastern, some of them were South Asian, some of them were African, some of them were East Asian. And he also did Pilgrim's Progress, and he did Native Americans, and they don't look caricaturized, and they don't look like savages, and they look very noble in a way that is acknowledging them as peers and not as some kind of inferior. And he does the same thing with all of the different paintings that I've noticed, because as much as I love GOUACHE or Nielsen or Leyendecker, I see a lot of Orientalist caricatures of different races in their pieces. You know, GOUACHE and Nielsen and them have some good-looking people from those cultures, but then they also have some caricatures of somebody that looks horribly racist if they're Chinese or if they're Middle Eastern or African. You know, there's a lot of horrible Sambo-type characters. And I don't think I ever saw that in my research of Henry Justice Ford. And that was really, I think, remarkable, because he was operating even earlier than them. Yet he maintained this sort of like personal integrity for all of these illustrations. So if you look at his illustrations, you'll notice a European princess will have the same dignified grace and look as a princess from the Arabian Nights, you know, and so and the same thing will happen regardless of who he's painting or what age he's painting. His old Middle Eastern men don't look like some kind of horrible caricature like little dwarf sultan from Disney's Aladdin. They look like real people. They look like wise people. And so he doesn't take these older people from different cultures and do what some of these other artists do and turn them into like racist stereotype caricatures. And I was actually serendipitously doing this study this week. I had a discussion on one of the
internet drama. Yeah,
there was some internet drama on a Muddy Colors blog post that was posted just yesterday, I think.
What's Muddy Colors for people who don't know?
Muddy Colors is just an art blog, and you can check it out and follow it the way you would other people's blogs about various things. In this case, you'll learn about art and illustration from contemporary illustrators working right now. And what's interesting is that there is a lot of like fire, you know, from somebody talking about cultural appropriation in the blog post, and she was absolutely right in what she was saying, which is that you need to be respectful and research when you're drawing and painting other cultures. There's nothing wrong with saying that. I mean, I thought we learned that in like elementary school. What's the debate? Where's the fire when people are saying, how dare is this guy? You know, I mean, I don't want to get too political here because I'm not a political channel. Even though I am a historian of international relations, I didn't start a channel on history or theology or philosophy, the different things that I managed to study in grad school regarding that, because I knew that it would just be a constant fight in the comments. So I did art instead because I love art and do that, and I think it brings more people together. But I do think that this is where sometimes the paths cross. Social issues that, you know, that have to be addressed in art too, and racism is one of them. So these older artists that were Orientalist, you don't want to make those people your models for their lack of sensitivity. Maybe you love their technique and maybe you love their execution, but don't copy their ignorance because they were living in a different time where that was okay, or where it was just ignored, you know, because in their society that was okay for those people. They weren't paying attention to minorities. Bringing it back to Henry Justice Ford, even though he was drawing in this pre-Me Too, pre-cultural appropriation, Orientalism is a bad thing time, he was definitely a person who managed to create artwork that can be viewed today and people are not going to be appalled. And I'm sure there's some discrepancies in costumes someplace because, he's probably didn't have some of this information. But it's clear from the way he drew his paintings and all the people that he drew that he respected everybody in every part of the world. I do know that his brothers were like star cricketers. They were like star cricket players. And that's totally irrelevant to his job as an artist, but it's just kind of cool because they actually got like medals. So there's lots of ink pieces that he did, and he did eventually add color to the later editions, and his preferred medium was watercolor. I kind of really like his style because I feel like you can tell that he's an inker, that he's somebody who spent most of his time inking, and the watercolor is just sort of like just for a glamorous dash of color because printers and book publishers are starting to have color available. So you can kind of see his colors are a little bit too bright in comparison to some of the later subdued colors that some artists use. It's almost like a Technicolor publishing version of the colors, but it's still a lot of fun because he still uses these amazing oranges and reds and stuff that are really exciting that I see show up in every piece, but clearly he was very interested in showing book publishers that color can be beautiful and vivid. He also had a real solid way of drafting. Like all of his people don't look like they don't have bones. You look at somebody like Kai Nielsen, and all of his people look super reedy and very, very slender, really sylph-like. And as a result of that, there is less connection to them as real people because nobody can be that skinny. And it's an attractive thing for a stylized painting, but there's less connection to it as a real character. Completely different with Henry Justice Ford's paintings. His illustrations, he actually has these people who have very realistic proportions. So I actually was really impressed with the fact that he did so many illustrations, and I'm assuming he used models and references because there's a lot of really realistic poses. But he does tend to draw the same face and the same body over and over again, like for the men and the women. So if he didn't use reference, like after the first book, 100 illustrations, I wouldn't be surprised if for like the rest of them he didn't, because he's drawing the same people over and over again, just in different clothes, different hair colors, different hair lengths and stuff, but the people look exactly the same. So he's essentially one of those comic book artists that memorizes how to draw, a certain body type and a certain face type for a man and a woman, then you can just keep repeating it from different angles and different costumes. And that's a great skill to have, but I just wanted to note that all of his faces look the same. And all of his bodies look the same.
But you were talking about how since his characters were proportioned normally, as opposed to Kai Nielsen's characters, that you thought it made people feel more connected to them?
Definitely me. And I would assume that the readers at the time, but I think a child reading it and even an adult reading it would take it more seriously if it was less cartoonish. So I do think that the fact that these weren't cartoonish illustrations, these were very realistic renderings of people, made these stories seem more vivid and alive somehow. I will say, though, that they had bland expressions. So that's one of the critiques I'd make of him. Could have worked on having slightly different expressions, because there's some paintings where somebody's in horrible danger and they have a very placid expression, or they're about to be seduced, or they're running away from like a rapist, literally, and they look really happy and have a really serene expression, and you're like, I wouldn't know that this is what was happening, like as the interaction between the two characters, if I hadn't read the fairy tale, So I would, that was the one thing, but that isn't a problem that he had on his own, because this is something that Dulac also did, that a lot of people did. Nielsen also did. I mean, you saw the painting and it was really decorative and gorgeous, but if you actually wanted to know like the emotional turmoil of a character, whether it was anger or fear or something, or like some other emotion that wasn't just sort of kind of happy, then it wasn't really, really done well. It was all very, very similar expressions. I didn't think that happened till later, where people started taking that more seriously about changing expressions in paintings or illustrations to match the narrative. Because it wasn't just him, it was everybody at the time. I think the other thing that he did really well was that he had a great empathy for animals, because I was really intrigued by this fairy tale with a gazelle in it, and this gazelle is actually like Puss in Boots. It's like a Middle Eastern version of Puss in Boots, and the cat has been replaced with a gazelle. I immediately saw it and liked it better than Puss in Boots as a cat, because I'm more of a ruminant person than a cat person. But I also ended up like just loving the story, because the Western version is so happy with like the cat helping the youngest son, you know, get the princess, defeat a giant, do all these amazing things. So first of all, that gazelle is freaking awesome because he's like cutting off serpents' heads, bringing diamonds to the sultan, you know, getting clothes for the master. But the guy in this story is not the youngest son of somebody, like, you know, which is like a traditional fairy tale trope for this guy is going to be a hero. He's bought by this person who finds a nickel or like the smallest coin possible, but this person has no money, has no job, has no home, does nothing, lives on a trash heap. So he's not going to end up being a hero. And he doesn't have a good work ethic. So it's not like he's somebody who's happy once this gazelle gets him riches, gets him clothes, kills a serpent and gets him a palace. No, this person stays with the mentality of being ungrateful and lazy. So long story short, too late, right? But the gazelle ends up dying at the end of this story. Unlike in Puss in Boots, bad people don't appreciate good people or good animals, you know? So to me, it was very touching to see that this animal was loyal and beautiful and did all this stuff for the person that bought him. But this person never changed. And as a result of that, this poor gazelle dies with a broken heart. An artist like Henry Justice Ford could have drawn the gazelle so humorously and yet so beautifully and nobly doing these tasks, and also at the end being so heartbroken. Totally fitting also that a Middle Eastern version is going to be sadder than the Western version, because that happens often with like all these stories my mom tells me that are Pakistani stories or Pakistani movies, that they're always sadder and have more like bad endings and heartbroken endings than stories and movies we see in the West. And so there's like this weird sort of like tragic realism that happens more in these stories from the East. And like, I felt like he understood that because he captured it really well. So another picture that I think shows how well Henry Justice Ford captured empathy for animals and sort of his respect for people and animals together was this illustration of this king sitting with his lion advisor and their friends in this fairy tale. And I just feel like the expression on the king's face and the lion's face, both of them looking at each other, is very sort of touching, very deep, and also very respectful and intelligent. Like the lion looks just as intelligent as the person looks just as empathetic and sort of loyal as the lion. I find all that to be really striking, that he could convey that in a simple ink illustration, because these are for fairy tales and I'm sure done under a deadline and, you know, done fast and everything. The fact that he could convey all of this stuff, which is this beauty and empathy towards animals and respect for cultures and all this other kind of stuff, it's really quite amazing.
A lot of lines in the clouds over there. Is there any tips on how to do it so cleanly?
I put a line like every 1.5 inch in the direction of the skyline that I wanted the dark sky value lines to be going in. And then when I came back in and put those parallel lines, they're easier to put down and not accidentally change direction or skew or cross over. And you can do it even neater than this as a result of that kind of help. You know, you can come back with a ruler and do that. But again, even with a ruler, you'd want to put down some guidelines every inch or two apart. Again, the same way that I said I was doing that freehand. So there's all sorts of different ways that you can help yourself make lines more tidy. And that's 2 of them.
Where do you start when you come back to a piece like this, if you've left it for a while?
Well, I try not to, I've said this before, come back to a piece after too long, because you actually hold your pen differently after a certain amount of time. You can sort of train yourself not to do that, or do some sort of warming up strokes to sort of help figure that out if you ever have to do that. You should try to do everything of one texture in one sitting. So do the claw in one sitting, or do him in one sitting, or the clouds in one sitting, because if you come back and do half of these cloud lines later, they're probably going to look different. So that's just a precaution. You don't have to do it. I'm sure some people can work around it, but I prefer to just do it all in one sitting for the similar texture parts of it.
You have a lot of different kinds of textures on this piece.
Mm-hmm.
Which one do you enjoy the most? Which one do you think is the trickiest?
I actually like all of them. It's kind of like the seasons, right? You know, you get sick of winter and you enjoy the snow for a while and you love the cold and whatever, then you want warmer and spring, and then you want it to be beachy weather, so then it can be summer and so on and so forth, and you wish yourself through the whole year, right? I mean, at least that's what I do. So I think it's the same thing with this, which is I really love the sort of round, stipply textures that are happening on the rock's claw here, and I love the parallel lines that are happening with the the cloud and skyline back there, and, you know, the hatching and everything, and also just a little bit of actual real drawing that happens on his face and hands and feet where it's not really a big texture. So I like all of it. I think if I had to do only one, I'd probably get sick of it. So I actually prefer the diversity of all of them here at the same time. The claw part, you do a rounder stroke to create these little sort of like calluses or little scaly skin texture that a bird has if you zoom in onto its feet. So, you know, so I'm just making a squiggly round random motion, and if I'm doing these lines, I obviously have to have more control, or doing a figure and a face even if it's that tiny. And
what kind of paper are you using?
I'm using Arch's sketch paper, and it's actually, I think, a 70-pound paper, and it's the first time I've ever used it. It's a really nice textural paper. It seems to have like this little cool tooth in it that does this horizontal thing, and then also some vertical lines there. And it's very delicate, it's very light, and it gives you very feathery ink lines. So what I would warn about is that if you are a chronic pain person like me, first of all of this ink and all this drawing and this tight controlled strokes is going to give you pain. This has been hard on me. I've been trying to get through it, and that would be for any paper. So this is the first piece I did on this paper, and it was a Muha study, and I think I might paint that in a future video at some point. There's a lot of really nice darker lines that I did with the thicker side of the marker, and then these really nice feathery lines that are with the smaller side of the marker. And I think it would be harder to achieve on cardstock as it slips more, and that's definitely the case where these lines look a little bit less delicate than what I ended up with here. But the bonus of working on this is that it photographs better, it scans better, it's smoother, so the marker glides and doesn't drink up the ink as much as the Arch's sketch paper. The Arch's sketch paper is really just drinking up all the ink in my marker, so I think if I use it again, I'm going to use pencil or liquid ink and not actually this marker.
What kind of inking and drawing tips do you have for people?
But I already mentioned how you would probably want to not use a paper this dry if you want your marker to last longer and you want less friction on your paper for hand issues or hand pain issues. But apart from that, I would just say warm up and practice different strokes. Watch my inking techniques video so you can get a little bit of an idea. And after that, it's just mostly drawing with your ink. I did have a pencil drawing under here, but it was rougher. It wasn't really the best pencil drawing, and some of it was just giving me some, you know, maybe even some messy made up shapes so I can sort of know what kind of texture was going in there. But I'm actually drawing with my ink as I'm going along. You'll probably have noticed that I've erased a lot of the stuff that I had there before, and I'm actually just using my marker to draw and ink at the same time, because I have a general idea of where I'm going, but all the details I'm drawing in. That's why it's going to take me a little bit slower and longer to ink this, because I'm actually making some of it up. Just keep that in mind, is that you don't have to slavishly copy anything, whether it's a study from a painting or from a photograph or from real life.
What do you mean by drawing with ink? You said that a couple of times. As opposed to what?
Well, as opposed to making sure this was a really polished, finished drawing with pencil.
And how would that be different? How would your approach be different? What's the pros and cons of each of those?
Now that I'm drawing with the ink, I'm looking at this and looking at my reference and doing the ink lines like that. Whereas if I'd actually polished up this drawing to a finished point, and this is super rough. I mean, this is going to have to all be mostly erased and redone because those are just blobs, just like I did down here. So if I had actually done this drawing polished, then I could just close this reference and I would be able to just ink much faster.
Is that better or worse?
It depends on what you're doing, and I've done it both ways. I don't know that I actually have much of a preference, but yeah, it's definitely easier to ink when your pencil drawing is better. So it depends on what you're looking for. I think.
Do you have anything to say about freehand drawing?
It's going to help you ink better. It'll help you paint better, because you're doing a lot of drawing with your paint when you paint, because you're probably only going to have outlines with the pencil. All the inside parts, you're going to have to draw that part with your paint. So as a result of practicing your freehand drawing skills, your painting skills will get better. And it also means that if you don't like your pencil drawing or cover it up, you'll be able to very easily continue to work on your piece because you can draw it over the pencil lines with paint. But if you don't know how to freehand draw, then sometimes your drawing is stilted, and then your painting might end up looking stilted too. And also on top of that, if you cover your drawing up, sometimes you might panic because you're like, well, how do I get that back? It's gone. And there's ways to transfer it back onto your paper and such, but I'm just saying that it'll serve you really well if you practice your drafting and drawing skills. Now, I'm not expecting you to start there. It just ends up something you have to do with practice. And I mentioned that in my 5 ways to draw video, is that you can use a grid, you can use a proportional divider to help your freehand skills. If you don't even want to do that, you can actually guideline trace And those are all things that can help you draw. I would say that if you use a proportional divider, that's still freehand drawing, just with training wheels, and probably also for the grid. When it comes to the guideline trace, I think that's something you should maybe reserve until your freehand drawing skills are developed enough that when you do that, you don't feel like you're just making yourself lazy with your drafting skills. But, you know, it's a personal thing. If you don't like that, if that's not what you want to do, if you want to just trace all your stuff or whatever, then that's you. I just know what I feel like has worked for a lot of the artists that I admire, and also for myself, which is that try to over time develop your freehand drafting skills. I mean, I don't think I would have had an easy time correcting all of this and getting all the details if I couldn't freehand draw. I mean, how could I possibly do all of this unless I was doing it over some kind of light table, right? Because this is a really complicated piece and I have to try to figure out what I'm doing here. I'm gonna erase all of it because, like I said, it's just sort of implying that there is gonna be texture there. Now I'm gonna freehand draw it there. And I think anybody can do that, but some people aren't comfortable doing it. And I think that's just a matter of developing your freehand skills so that you can figure out how to do that. And this isn't the hardest piece to draw, actually. There's a lot of abstract texture here, and help you have more maneuverability and diversity in the kind of things that you can do, because you don't want to have tracing as a crutch. It can be a helper, but I think that's what it should be, unless you really are like, you know, I've got 6 months left to live and you want to do all the painting you possibly can.
Seems like a good policy.
Right, I mean, but apart from that, I mean, what reason could you have to not want to do that? Because I do think it would help your painting and your inking a lot if you could practice sketching as much as you can.
What else is it like when you're drawing so small?
Well, drawing this small is going to be challenging for his face, because obviously his face and his hands have gotten so teeny as to become obscure and annoying, and you could do better details if it was larger and such. But if you were going to be doing the rest of the piece, it'll get finished faster. So for me, where I'm sitting here complaining about this paper sucking up the ink, definitely a larger piece would suck up even more ink on this dry paper, but also you wouldn't get done as fast. And for me, because I have chronic pain, I prefer to work on smaller pieces, because the smaller pieces just have less brush strokes or ink strokes or pencil strokes, so it just actually adds up. And you do have to be more coordinated though. So again, that comes back to the freehand drawing and stuff, which is that if I didn't develop my freehand drawing skills, then at this size, if I made any small error moved over, it would be harder for me to definitely fix that. So that's the kind of thing where I have to say, okay, that's why I developed my freehand drawing skills, is so I can have the luxury of drawing really small and still have some degree of accuracy, because I've tried to practice my eye-hand coordination. But if you drew bigger, you could have more room for messing up a sketch, because it'll still look pretty accurate if you're drawing a larger sketch. And then the other thing is, when you draw larger, it's bigger and prettier to look at on a wall, and usually sells better and everything. So, you know, there's different pros and cons. I have a post on Patreon where I covered all of that in detail, all the pros and cons to big and small art. And it's funny, I get that question a lot because I guess I draw relatively small. Oh, I'm going to provide the link in my free Patreon post and also in my YouTube description to the Muddy Colors blog post I was talking about. And keep in mind that it is going to be a can of worms, but as somebody who studied Orientalism and East-West relations and respect and everything, you know, I had to throw my oar in on that post, so you'll see me having commented on that post numerous times, fortunately or unfortunately. If you're interested, you can check it out, and if not, then just I hope you enjoy this video. Well, Wizards, hope you enjoyed joining me and Elijah talking about this Henry Justice Ford master's study and some of the themes around it while I did a master study of Sindbad in ink. Please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my website link, Skillshare, and Patreon page to support my art and art channel below. Thanks for parking your brushes here and wishing you all fantastical ink adventures.